I guess there's been some fairly critical developments in that the Russians appear to have taken over Debaltseve, and that's causing a lot of hand-wringing and grief and a lot of emotional reaction on the internet, which I follow quite closely. And I guess it's being pictured, depending on your point of view, as a tremendous loss, an act of treason, act of incompetence. People are blaming Poroshenko, people are blaming the Ukrainian military, on and on and on. And I think overall, I wouldn't get overly excited about it. I think people have made much more of Debaltseve than its real importance warrants. I've heard the term that it's of strategic importance because it's a regional railway hub. Well, a regional railway hub might be of some tactical importance, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's of any great strategic importance. It'll make things easier logistically for the juntas in Luhansk and Donetsk to, transport arms and soldiers and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But, in the more national sphere of interest, I don't think it's that particularly crucial or strategic, say the way that Mariupol is. Mariupol is strategically important because it basically blocks Putin and the Russians from connecting Russian mainland to Crimea. And that is a huge, huge problem from them logistically to be able to supply and deal with the population in Crimea, which is getting increasingly restive. And I think it's probably a good course of action, and rightly so, that I think the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government has been focusing on building up the defense of Mariupol rather than Debaltseve. To me, Debaltseve, the only real significant importance that it had was as a bargaining chip in Minsk II. And as we have seen, Minsk II isn't worth the paper that it's written on. I mean, it was never observed from the first second of the ceasefire that came about on midnight on Saturday. Like I think the running joke on the internet, on Facebook, that I've seen is that the Ukrainians ceased, but the Russians kept on firing. So that's what a ceasefire means to Putin. It means that it's binding on the other side, but it doesn't really restrict him or his minions from doing anything that they want. This is the other thing that has been bothering me a lot as I read a lot of the commentary and on the internet by not only the people that like to inhabit the Facebook internet scene, but also even serious commentators, that there is this great fear of Putin, that the reason that the West has not provided more direct military assistance to Ukraine is this fear that things will escalate, that if they supply arms to the Ukrainians, the Russians will escalate, and it'll keep on escalating and escalating. And I think it's a misreading from two perspectives. One is, yeah, undoubtedly it will escalate because the Russians want to keep that whole eastern Ukraine and Ukraine in general destabilized. But there's a limit to that escalation. People seem to think that the Russian armed forces are unlimited. I watched a very interesting video last week of Snyder, whom, as we all know, is an expert on Eastern Europe, having written the Bloodlands, and he's probably one of the foremost, most knowledgeable commentators on what's happening. And what he pointed out very rightly is that the Russians do not have unlimited armed forces to devote to Ukraine. There is an upper limit. If you look at the total forces, military forces of Russia, yeah, they're somewhere between 700,000 to 1 million men. But you've got to take into account that a lot of them are not useful in terms of dealing with Ukraine. The nuclear forces, the strategic forces, the Navy, etc., etc. The total ground forces of Russia are around 400,000, of whom about 200,000 are conscripts that rotate in and out and are of, well, marginal military value, shall we say. So really, Russia only has about 200,000 in professional, probably well-trained, experienced ground forces, infantry, the boots on the ground, so to speak. And they've got a lot of territory to cover, and they've got a lot of trouble spots along the whole of the Russian border, stretching way out into Siberia. They got Chechnya, Ingushetia, Georgia, Ossetia, you name it. So at most, maybe they can dedicate 40, 50, 60, 70,000 troops to the whole of the Ukrainian campaign, before they start running into some very significant problems of overstretching their capabilities. So yes, there is some escalation possible, but it's not unlimited escalation. And if Ukraine and the Ukrainian military ever get their act together where they can field a couple of 100,000 in terms of ground forces, that would be way more than sufficient to keep the Russians at bay. The only key factor there is that they are lacking in technology, armaments, modern armaments, and ammunition. They've got a lot of Kalashnikovs and the basic stuff, but they need sophisticated anti-tank weapons. They need sophisticated technology for targeting, satellite imagery, all that kind of stuff. And this is what they're looking for from the West. And I think if the West does supply that, it will keep the Russian forces at bay. And it will, undoubtedly Putin will try and escalate, but he will eventually hit a wall where he can't go any further without overtly committing the Russian army and doing a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which he can't really do. He doesn't have the forces, because to fully invade and occupy even eastern Ukraine, the whole of eastern Ukraine, say Kharkiv, Kyiv, Poltava, whatever, would require hundreds of thousands of ground troops, which he doesn't have. Or he wouldn't have. Like, if he does that, he would leave all of his other border areas wide open, and of course the Chechens and the rest of Muslim nations on the periphery would take advantage of that. So he does have some real tactical limitations to what he can do.